On the morning of July 24th, 2025, the world woke to the devastating news that wrestling legend Hulk Hogan had passed away at his home in Clearwater, Florida, after sudden cardiac arrest, a medical emergency that struck without warning and ended the life of a man who had defined an era of sports entertainment. As tributes poured in from fellow wrestlers, fans, and global media, quiet questions began to surface about the empire he left behind. A legacy built from decades in the ring, television deals, film roles, and lucrative endorsements. That fortune, estimated in the tens of millions, now stands at the center of a complex inheritance that will shape the lives of his two children, Brooke and Nick. Both grew up under the weight of his fame and the glare of reality television. And now they face not only the grief of losing their father, but the challenge of deciding what to do with the legacy he left. Will they rise to protect and expand it, or step away and carve out lives that finally belong only to them? Brooke Hogan was born Brooke Ellen Bolia on May 5th, 1988, in Tampa, Florida, into a household where fame wasn't just in the air. It was the air. From her earliest memories, she watched her father Hulk Hogan walk through the door after legendary matches, still carrying the electricity of arenas that shook with chants of his name. As a child, Brooke often waited for him backstage at WWE events, sitting cross-legged on the floor among piles of merchandise and action figures bearing his image. She would hum along to his entrance music, a little girl already comfortable in a world where the cameras never stopped rolling. Family dinners were often interrupted by phone calls from promoters or television producers, and she learned early on that her father's presence was as much a brand as it was a man. When she entered her teenage years in the early 2000s, that brand began to shape her own life. Brooke signed with a music label while appearing in Hogan Knows Best, the family's reality show that turned their home into a stage for millions of viewers. On screen, she seemed confident and ambitious, a teenager with bright blonde hair and big plans to become a pop star. Off screen, she struggled with the intense scrutiny that came with carrying the Hogan name. A hidden truth emerged during this period. While negotiating a recording deal, she discovered that the contract wasn't entirely hers. Her father had quietly signed on as a co-owner of the rights, giving him final say over song releases and financial decisions. That revelation stunned her. The independence she thought she was building had strings attached. Brooke didn't resent him outright, but it planted a seed of doubt about whether she could ever step out of his shadow. The mid-2000s through the early 2010s were a whirlwind. Brooke released albums like Undiscovered and appeared in wrestling storylines as an on-screen authority figure in TNA wrestling. Her image was everywhere, on stage, in music videos, in tabloids reporting on family drama as Hulk and Linda's marriage crumbled. Brooke maintained a calm public face, but those who knew her closely described a young woman exhausted by constant comparison. When she tried to branch into acting, casting directors often introduced her as Hulk Hogan's daughter before mentioning her own name. It became clear that the spotlight followed her because of him, not despite him. In the years after the reality show faded, Brooke reinvented herself quietly. She launched a small fashion line, started working as a songwriter for other artists, and cultivated a loyal following online. By the late 2010s, she had carved out a space where the Hogan name was part of her story, but not the entire headline. She was careful with investments, choosing smaller ventures over risky celebrity deals. Even so, the connection to her father remained strong. He would occasionally post her projects on his social media, and they spoke often about future collaborations. Everything changed in July 2025 when news broke that Hulk Hogan had died suddenly of cardiac arrest at his home in Clearwater. For Brooke, the loss was devastating, not just emotionally but in practical terms. She was suddenly an heir to a vast, complicated estate. In the days following his death, lawyers presented her with documents detailing her inheritance. It wasn't just cash, it was rights to the Hulkamania trademark, residuals from decades of licensing deals, and a controlling interest in a dormant media partnership her father had been negotiating before he passed. There was also the shock of discovering files that confirmed what she had only half understood as a teenager. Her father had retained stakes in her early music catalog, and now those stakes were legally hers. As she stood in her father's office, Surrounded by championship belts, framed magazine covers, and contracts that charted a lifetime of success, Brooke felt the weight of the decision ahead. Should she embrace the Hogan legacy fully, using the assets to relaunch her brand with the power of his name? Or should she sell off parts of the empire to free herself from the shadow that had defined her since birth? The world watched, speculating about her next move, as Brooke Hogan faced the first chapter of her life without her father. A chapter where every choice would carry the echo of the man who built an empire and left it in her hands. Nick Hogan, born Nicholas Allen Beliai on July 27, 1990 in Los Angeles, entered the world carrying a last name that already filled stadiums. From the very beginning, his life moved to a rhythm of roaring crowds and flashing cameras. He spent his early years darting between locker rooms and tour buses, learning to fall asleep to the sound of travel and the distant echo of an arena celebrating his father's victories. To him, the towering men in the backstage corridors were not celebrities. They were friends, mentors, larger-than-life figures who let him climb into the ring after hours and hold their championship belts. Summers often meant following his father on the road, watching him transform from a quiet, gentle dad into the unstoppable Hulk Hogan, a persona that electrified the world. Those moments instilled pride in Nick, but even as a boy, he felt the subtle pressure of being born into a legacy no ordinary child could understand. As the new millennium arrived, Nick's teenage years were thrust into public view. The family opened their home to cameras for Hogan Knows Best, and millions of viewers saw him as the fun-loving son with a mischievous streak. He showcased his love for fast cars, joking about bending rules while his father half smiled and half warned. The truth behind the scenes was more complicated. Nick wasn't just playing with cars, he was obsessed with them. He spent late nights in the garage tinkering with engines, studying every part until he could assemble one blindfolded. Hulk encouraged the interest, even surprising Nick with high-end cars that symbolized not just wealth, but trust. But in 2007, the story took a dark turn. Behind the wheel of a Toyota Supra, Nick lost control at high speed, causing a crash that left a friend permanently injured. Headlines screamed of privilege and recklessness. News outlets aired footage of a devastated Hulk escorting his son into court. Publicly, Hulk told the world, "He's my son. We'll face this together." Privately, the conversations were brutal. Nick felt his father's disappointment more deeply than any judge's sentence. After serving a short jail term and settling lawsuits, Nick retreated from the limelight. From 2008 to 2018, he tried to rebuild himself quietly, opening a small auto garage with a few friends. The garage was his attempt to prove that he was more than his last name. Business was unpredictable. Some months they barely broke even. As debts mounted, Nick made a decision he kept hidden for years. He sold a rare sports car that Hulk had given him, a car his father had described as a symbol of trust and a reward for responsibility. Nick signed the papers in silence, watching the car be driven away, knowing he could never tell his father. That secret became a shadow, following him into every family dinner, every phone call. Each time Hulk posted a proud photo of his son, Nick felt a pang of guilt, convinced that if the truth came out, the fragile peace between them would shatter. In the late 2010s, Nick began cautiously stepping back into the world he had fled. He consulted on wrestling documentaries, helped coordinate memorabilia sales, and built connections with producers who wanted to capture the golden era of WWE. He stayed off camera, a ghost in the background. But those who worked with him saw a man trying to reconcile who he was with where he came from. Family gatherings softened over the years. Hulk and Nick would spend nights in the home office, flipping through old scrapbooks. Hulk would laugh at photographs of his early matches, then look at Nick and say, "You're going to figure it out, brother. Just give it time." Those words lingered, but the guilt over the sold car remained like a stone in Nick's chest. Then came July 24th, 2025. The phone call from Brooke shattered the fragile normalcy Nick had built. "Nick, Dad's gone." The words blurred in his ears as he gripped the steering wheel on the drive to Clearwater. The house felt frozen in time, filled with the trophies of a man who had lived larger than life. Championship belts lined the walls, photographs captured decades of triumph, and yet the air felt heavy with absence. Days later, lawyers gathered the family to go through the estate. Nick expected cash, maybe the mansion, maybe a few collectible items. What he didn't expect was a portfolio detailing a private trust his father had created in his name. The trust contained more than property. There were significant shares in a sports media company Hogan had quietly invested in, rights to unreleased footage, and a list of assets designed to set Nick up not just as a beneficiary, but as someone who could expand the Hogan legacy. Buried within the paperwork was a sealed letter written by Hulk himself, dated only months earlier. Nick unfolded it with shaking hands. The letter was simple, handwritten, but every word cut deep. Nick, I know about the car. I knew all along. You did what you thought you had to do, and I never stopped believing in you. That's why I'm leaving you this. Build something. Make me proud. The plot twist hit him like a tidal wave. For years, he had carried guilt, believing he had betrayed his father's trust, only to discover Hulk had known and silently forgiven him. Tears blurred his vision as he read the letter again and again. Now, in addition to the weight of grief, Nick held in his hands a fortune and a choice. He could step fully into the Hogan legacy, running the media company, preserving his father's image, and proving to the world that he was worthy of the name. Or he could sell everything, disappear from the spotlight forever, and finally write a story that had nothing to do with wrestling, nothing to do with Hulkamania. In that quiet office filled with the echoes of a legend, Nick Hogan sat alone, the letter resting against his chest. The cameras were gone, but the world still watched, waiting to see if he would rise to honor the empire his father built, or finally break free and forge his own identity. For the first time in his life, the decision was entirely his, and his next step would shape not only his future, but the future of the Hogan legacy itself. But Hulk Hogan's story is only one strand in a far wider web, a world where the glow of fame builds towering empires while quietly splintering the lives within them. Beyond Brooke and Nick are others who bear names just as heavy, carrying untold chapters of triumphs and betrayals, legacies bound up in secrets the public never glimpsed. In the episodes ahead, we'll step deeper into those hidden hallways, where families born of golden reputations will conceal fractures no spotlight ever exposed. Stay close. The next story is already stirring in the shadows. If you don't want to miss what comes next, subscribe to Legacy Uncovered and join us as we reveal more untold lives behind the legends. Thank you for listening.